Hi all, there's been an absolutely fantastic instructive game played at the Weekend Z tournament in the Netherlands. Caruana playing white, FIDE 28-20, playing against the current world champion Magnus Carlsen. Let's have a look. I think it's really instructive for showing us how king safety is really important in chess and how to attack the king. Caruana playing white played e4. Magnus Carlsen played the Sicilian defence. So eyeing that central d4 square, and now after knight f3, knight c6, again central d4 square is black's focus. This invites a Sicilian sveshnikov if white plays d4, for example, like this, is a very interesting line, Sicilian sveshnikov. But of course there are other variations you can go into at this point. But this is very, very trendy in recent years for white to try and play this more positional approach, with a more positional approach, a bit like the royal pairs, often doubling pawns though, but sometimes constructing a centre with c3 and d4. Magnus played g6 here. g6 is the most popular idea. Black is trying to exert influence on d4 with the fianchetto now, and doesn't mind the double pawns here, the possibility of doubling pawns, and in fact here, after taking, takes with the d pawn. So black's strategy is crystal clear up until this point. It's all about d4, putting more pressure on d4. Capturing away from the centre is breaking what you might think is a beginner rule, but here, yes, the greater justification is to open up the bishop and maintain an iron grip on the d4 square. d3, bishop g7, and now this pin could be quite annoying. White plays h3, it's the most popular move, stopping any pin. Knight f6, knight c3. Now here, b6. This is all very well practiced before this position. Bishop e3. But here's a slight surprise. Usually players with black play castling. Magnus played a very interesting move, a rare bird move. I mean, this is over 400 games at least in line, but this move is only 4. e5, and I don't want to go into too much depth on this, just some analysis from earlier, but it seems as though knight takes e5 might be playable as a try for advantage for white. It's a bit of a tricky position. This wasn't played though. White played castling, just castling. So if he had played this, there's a lot of complexity after knight takes e4, unveiling an attack, and there's options for white, but it seems queen f3 is interesting, f5, and this position I think requires further investigation. It seems as though white might be ending up with a small advantage, but yeah, that's for the opening theoreticians here. But yeah, it's a little bit of a cheeky move if white doesn't play knight takes e5, because from an attacking player's perspective now, after castling, the e5 pawn is very useful. It's doing two things. It's clamping down further on white's d4, and it's also a nice square on f4 that it potentially supports. So for an attack later against the white king, this is very useful. Furthermore, it supports, once this knight moves, f5, f4 to chase the bishop, which would gain an important wedge on the king side, and that might be useful for the attacking player. So the game has a very exciting scene set now in this position. After this e5, black now castled here. Now white plays a3. He wants to chisel away at black's pawn structure. The positional school of chess, which the first world champion emphasized, basically structure is a great way of accumulating advantages. So white has accumulated a certain advantage here with an advantage in structure. However, black has the bishop pair. It was a bit of a trade-off, giving black the dangerous bishop pair. You'll note here, by the way, that knight takes e5. Again, there's this tactical idea of knight takes e4, which is much more favourable now for black than the previous time this was possible. But so yeah, white is concerned. White's main intention is to chisel away at the structure here on the queen side. Finally, though, Magnus does protect e5 with queen e7. So chess, though, is not just all about pawn structure and accumulating advantages based on pawn structure. There is an element of king safety. In the Romantic era of chess, king safety was all the rage, and there weren't such concerns for building up a long-term positional advantage. Here, it seems the scene is really well and truly set for white trying to play positioning on the queenside and gain material and consolidate and win in perhaps the endgame. But black, with the bishop pair here, is in a great position now, especially with that e5 pawn, to try for what is, you could say is a direct attack. Furthermore, in this position, with white playing h3 to avoid that pin, the f4 square is a little bit more sensitive than usual. When a knight arrives on f4, for example, then it's difficult to kick it with g3. But that might not be the only choice. There might be f5, f4 as well as putting a knight on f4. So let's see what happened now. White confidently played queen b1. It signals positional play on the queen side to play for things like b4 to start to try and break black's pawn chain into smithereens here. If, for example, we have this structure, that exchange, then there'll be double pawns here, an isolated pawn here. c5 particularly vulnerable to frontal attacks or attacks with knight a4 later. So that would be a really bad target. And then the dismantling would probably continue with white gaining other key squares after winning c5. That's the basic plan for white, to chisel away with b4 soon. So black with the bishop pair goes in for the attack with knight h5. So at the moment there's a question mark. Does he want to play for knight f4, or does he want to play like this? And the answer to that now is revealed. After b4, instead of knight f4, which is interesting, Magnus Carlsen actually played f5. So for the instructiveness of this move, let's see. Well, the rook can play more of a part in the attack potentially on their f file. Immediately there'll be ideas of taking and putting pressure on f3. Is white worried by that, or is he going to carry on the queen side? White plays b takes c5, and actually f takes isn't played. I think white believes he could weather that storm of the attack, or he might not even routinely recapture. There's other choices available there. Maybe even a temporary pawn sack. Maybe after takes there's other options available to white, like knight g5 for example. So here in fact black played f4. He took the opportunity now, while that bishop can't go on this diagonal, to push the bishop back. Bishop d2, and yes, this pawn sacrifice, is it going to be a real pawn sacrifice if black, for example, played a move like b5, or is Magnus going to allow his pawn structure to be seemingly wrecked with b takes, but at least maintaining material equality? Well, the thing is with b5, it just runs into a4. After a4, this is quite problematic for black. It kind of speeds up white's queenside play, in fact. For example, b takes, knight takes, there's an immediate threat of knight b6 here. This would be very unpleasant. And in fact, say for example bishop b7, knight b2, and we're coming in to d6 potentially. Black doesn't need this hassle factor. This would be very, very unpleasant. And also e5 will be quite weak if white starts to put more pressure on e5. So let's go back here. In this position, Magnus does accept the double pawns as the lesser evil approach here on the queen side. We see check, bishop e6, queen a4. So white is now attacking the c6 pawn, and of course a7. The queen, though, is a bit away from the king. Is this a significant factor here? We see rook ac8, queen a5, as though knight a4 is coming up next to start actually literally winning a pawn now, what seems to be potentially quite an important pawn strategically to help break down black's position. Magnus, though, now plays the move g5, so very aggressive stuff, carrying on with his attack not minding the possibility of knight a4, which occurs now. So knight a4, it wouldn't be a very nice choice to move this pawn forward. e5 will be under pressure laterally, so it's not very nice choices there. It seems now Magnus, he has to go in for the attack, but he does have more attacking pieces over here potentially than white can defend at the moment. This rook is also part of the attack, so how crude or effective will this attack be? g4, h takes, bishop takes g4. Now here there's no time for knight takes c5. White would get absolutely crushed if knight takes c5. Black could just take care, play a check, and this is a very dangerous rook here. Rook f6, this rook left, let's come here, familiar mating pattern, for example like this, knight g3. It would be absolutely vicious to allow this kind of thing after f takes, double attacking, queen h2 and queen f3. That would be the end of white. So white has to trade very carefully. He can't play knight takes c5. He plays queen takes c5, harassing the queen, trying not to give black too much time to do anything. Queen f6, and now this might not be the most accurate defensive move. Knight h2 was played. White clearly wants to be able to play f3 and block this pawn, but Magnus plays a very important finesse here, and this is very important for the tactical player going for the king to not lose any time at all if possible for their attack. Can you guess what black played in this position? If I give you 5 seconds to pause the video. Okay, Magnus continued with f3, a very, very energetic move, trying to prevent defensive resources like f3 from white. Of course, it's a temporary piece sacrifice. If g3, that's unpalatable to leave that pawn there. Knight takes g4, queen g6. So here, very interesting position indeed. Knight e3 looks to be not very clever because of the g2 issues and the issues around that. For example, knight here, and then there's all sorts of threats. That's unpalatable. So after queen g6, queen e7 was played as the defensive resource. Queen g5 is unveiled. Will this save black? Well, if Magnus now routinely played queen takes g4, then queen g5 is indeed a very nice defense for white, saving the day, and he can carry on with his advantages accumulated on this side of the board. But a very key and important finesse, f takes g2, hitting the rook. The rook moves. Perhaps d1 is interesting to consider here to protect the bishop, but rook here, trying to use that queenside b file. Queen takes g4, queen g5, queen e2, the queen's evicted, queen g4, queen g5. But here, yes, the idea for white to be content with a draw, but Magnus, he takes queens, he doesn't want a repetition there, and plays knight f4, and this is still quite dangerous, immediately threatening knight h3 check to fork king and bishop. Perhaps the engines suggest in post-mortem king h2 is a safe position enough for white. With engine precision, this might be good enough to hold off any attack. For example, bishop f6 here, rook f7, f3 now, and apparently, yeah, there might not be enough material here remaining for black to build up a formidable attack. What happened in the game, yes, is very interesting here. Instead of king h2, maybe Fabiano might have misevaluated this position. He played bishop takes f4, not really seeing that there's too much attacking potential. It's very simplified, isn't it? There's only two rooks, a bishop, and maybe a pawn around the king. Is that enough to weave a mating net here? Really? White took on g2 now, offering an exchange sack, but he's already accumulated a pawn or two. So at the moment 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1 pawn for the exchange, but the knight will be quite dominating. So does black want to take this rook? He plays actually check, signifying he might not now, especially after this next move, because keeping the bishop on means there's always bishop e5 to king g3, and that would be very dangerous for the king to come up the board. So we see king f1, but here, if now Magnus took on a1, that would really be the end of his attacking prospects. For example, taking rook f4 can be parried by king e1. The king can actually come out like this. So this dark square bishop here is very important to maintain, to try and control this diagonal actually. So the idea of rook f4 combined with bishop h6 looks very dangerous. Rook f4 is played immediately here. That's important finesse as well. If you consider the move orders here, if bishop h6 had been played, then actually white now has a very important defensive resource which has to be factored in. Can you see, if I give you 5 seconds, what white could play to defend this position against rook f4? Yep, rook b4. So if rook f4, white would now have e5. It's a protected rook, protecting that rank. So the way Magnus has played it is much more incisive. This is the right move order here, rook f4. So any rook b4, we can just play rook h4. And then if king e1 to head to d2, we can play bishop h6. So you can see that the rook, the bishop and the pawn are actually very, very dangerous to weave a mating net like here. So let's go back to this position. After rook f4, c3 was played. And now another very accurate move, rook d8. Putting pressure down that d file. d4. And Magnus shows he's not yet computer strength in playing out the attacks, even though the attack has been played very accurately so far. In this position, Magnus played bishop h6. So I move 33, but there's actually a very, very incisive way of playing this position, it seems, with bishop takes d4. So if c takes, even though it's only 2 rooks, this is incredibly dangerous. After rook h4, this pawn and the 2 rooks are still a mating net. If king e1, rook takes d4 here, cutting the king off that d file, and there's no defense to rook h1. That would be a mating net. This is a really crushing move, bishop takes d4. But yeah, Magnus is just human after all. He plays bishop h6, still very strong and dangerous. The king tries to wriggle out king e1 at the expense of a central pawn. It's a very bad position though for white. King d1. And now another excellent move in this position at move 35. What would you play here? If I give you 5 seconds to pause the video, a really fantastic move is played in this position. Okay, blasting white centre with c5, trying to lure the knight away from b2 here. If the knight took, then the rook would run rampant on the 7th rank without any rook b2 resource. The knight at the moment is supporting rook b2, so if rook e2 had been played instead of c5, then rook b2, defending for a moment. Still black's better, but it'd be a nuisance. So c5 really a destructive move in the circumstance, trying to get a rook to the 7th without interruption with rook b2. King c2, white is losing pawns now, c takes, king d3, and the rook comes to the 7th here. Very dangerous position, threatening rook d2, and also d takes check is useful. White played c4. If he played c takes, then rook d2 check is pretty nasty. This is a loose piece here. So we can just take this and win this knight. Ouch. So in this position, c4. So after all of this, black is now a pawn up. 2 pawns up. It's resignable for white. The attack has created a massive advantage. Rook d1, rook e2. And here, white resigned. Black has luxury options like check and f2 coming up. So it's a pretty hopeless position, this final position. 2 pawns down in any case. A wonderful attack. Okay, might have been a moment of a lack of precision, but otherwise a very wonderful attack and a very daring idea in the opening, which may be a little bit of a bluff, you could say, e5, because it's actually not in live book, I assure you. The most common move is castling here, but with that little bluff, that's an attacking pawn basically later. If it's combined with f5, f4, it becomes an attacking pawn supporting f4 later as the game continues. So the dismantlement of black's queenside, yes, it looks horrible on queenside, but if you want to attack the king, it's good sometimes for the opponent's resources to be on the queenside anyway, even if they're munching a pawn or even 2 sometimes, or 3. So here, very incisive move, f3, making every tempo count. F takes, another very precise move to make sure queen g5 isn't as effective. But and at the critical moment now, here, even though it simplified the attack, still started to rage on. White should have, it seems, considered the move king h2 in this position. But the attack, believe it or not, raged on here. Only 2 rooks, a bishop, and these pawns show that they're really dangerous. Black keeping that dark square bishop. Very important to keep the dark square bishop, and some horrendous threats are being generated now. So with combination ideas like bishop h6 and the rook coming to h1. So fantastic attacking stuff. The other rook for that d file. White doesn't really want to play a rook d1. Its king would be not escaping then after rook h4. With something occupying d1, it would be even harder. So here's the moment where bishop takes d4 would be absolutely destructive for white. An unbelievably crushing idea. The 2 rooks and that pawn, providing a killer mating there. But even so, black's advantage is winning here in any case now, especially after this fine move c5, pardon me, destroying white's centre. d4 is really under fire. So king c2, taking a pawn there, and yes, white's position is resignable. Magnus Carlsen has made this game look easy, but yes, some bravery there, some precision there, and yeah, it was a game of structure versus the attack, where the attacking player triumphed. Hope you enjoyed that one. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.